Welcome to Too Complicated for History. I am Isaac S. Loftus, and I am joined by my co-host, Dr. Lynn Price Robbins. How you doing, Lynn?
Hi, doing good. Excited.
We come to you twice a month, bringing you the history that has fallen through the cracks in your curriculum through interviews with the authors who are studying and exploring that history. Today, Lynn told me that we were doing the subject of today's interview was history's most important Ernest. And much to my surprise, that wasn't Ernest P. Worrell. So, Lynn, could you introduce our guest today?
I happily, Isaac. We're very excited today to have Charles Fournier, who is a teacher, a podcaster, and most importantly, a Hemingway scholar. And I'm going to share the title of your thesis, Restrictive and Liberating Vernacular Landscapes, Differentiating Hemingway's person from his persona through place. And that sounds very a big mouthful, but it's actually super interesting. So thanks so much for being here today, Charles.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm incredibly excited to talk about Hemingway, whose first name was Ernest, just for those who didn't know. In case you weren't aware, separate from his work. I think that's an that was a novel experience for me because I have a degree in playwriting. We don't have to talk about it. And my parents don't want to talk about it either. But I'm very familiar with his writing, but have never really explored him as a historical figure in any other context. So it was a really prepping for this interview was actually a ton of fun, and I think is a really interesting subject that will be new for a lot of people.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting that talking about just being familiar with his literature, it's almost like there's so much impact he's had on culture that we just don't realize in pop culture. So.
Which I am just reading your work. We were coming up with a lot of things that we've already talked about in our podcast, and how he's actually impacted it and played a role just kind of blew my mind. So I'm very excited about talking about that. But I do have to ask, why Ernest? Why Hemingway? Why is he the one that you chose to spend so much time becoming an expert on?
I think it starts in high school. Being in English classes, I think the first short story I read was Hills Like White Elephants, and then got into the Big Two-Hearted Rivers. And I love that, one, it was accessible, and two, like Hills Like White Elephants, you're kind of figuring it out. And when you realize what's going on and, his iceberg effect, where there's so much underneath the surface, you're like, oh, you feel so smart. And it's really cool. And I like that they were concise, especially, I guess, just being a high schooler. And then getting into college, I was drawn more to, I think, the persona and that performance of himself that you see through, his nonfiction. And I'm thinking about like A Movable Feast. I loved A Movable Feast. I thought that was so cool, but it also just felt like, have you read Ben Franklin's autobiography?
Mm-hmm.
So reading that, there's there's so much where you're like, you're full of it. This isn't.
Oh yeah.
Like he's just, it's so funny. And you're like, you're stretching it. And so I felt a little bit of that, but I also feel like thinking a lot about masculinity and thinking about the negative aspects of masculinity. And there was part of me that thinks like, I don't want to say it's Hemingway's fault, but like, boy, he contributed a lot to it. And so a lot of, I think my interest was just, I enjoyed the writing. I thought he was interesting. And it really kind of took off in grad school when I was in a Harlem Renaissance class, and we were talking about Langston Hughes, who's one of my other favorite writers. I think he's brilliant. And I made a joke. I was like, yeah, it's like if Hemingway and Hughes hung out, like that would never happen. And they hung out. They were both war correspondents in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. And like, this kind of blew my mind because like it's Langston Hughes. And then Hemingway was notorious for being, outwardly homophobic. And he has very racist tendencies, especially like in terms of advertising, what we saw in papers and how he treats people of color in his writing. But they were good buddies. Hemingway took Langston Hughes to bullfights. When Langston Hughes left the country to go back to the U.S., Hemingway threw him a party. And so there's a chapter in one of Langston Hughes's books. I can't remember if it's The Big Sea or I Wonder As I Wander, but in one of those books where it's just dedicated to Hemingway and what a nice guy he was. And it's mind blowing. And there's a picture of Hemingway with his arms around. Actually, here, can I step up real quick? I got a book with a picture.
Yeah, please do. We will describe it for those of you who are just listening, who are on YouTube.
Okay,
Yeah,
so this is Hemingway and the Black Renaissance. Brilliant book, edited by I think Gary Holcomb and Charles Scruggs. It's awesome. But we got Langston Hughes off on the side, Hemingway here, and so it just
And
that
they
broke
look
my
like
brain.
best buds.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's something that kind of threw me for a loop, and so I had to figure out like, okay, why did they
Who's this
hang
guy?
out? Yeah,
Actually, yeah. Huh.
and also Hemingway was notorious for anyone he met of note he would write about, and usually it was kind of negative. But there's also this weird tendency. I don't know if it's weird, but he didn't necessarily write about things he enjoyed. Like he didn't write a lot about his kids. Didn't write a ton about Hadley until the end of his life, and he didn't write about Langston Hughes, which they got along. So maybe he didn't have anything to. I don't know. I'm speculating, but it seems like everybody else he wrote about, he's like, let me tell you, this guy.
Positivity's boring, right?
Yeah.
This episode of Too Complicated for History is brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show and join the conversation, our membership is completely free. And that gives you access to our Discord, which is a place for like-minded history fans and even some of the historians that we've interviewed to just chat, hang out, and ask interesting questions. Our paid tiers give you access to exclusive content, live streams, and even signed book giveaways. Check it out today at patreon.com/primary source media. That's patreon.com/primary source media. Pat should put it in a graphic right about here. Now let's get back to the show. I think, first of all, I didn't realize that about Langston Hughes and Hemingway, but I also didn't realize, I'm not sure if it's surprising or not, that Langston Hughes was a war correspondent also. I mean, underrated incubator for writers, the Spanish Civil War, because I'm pretty sure Orwell was also there too.
Yeah, because they made, was it Spanish Earth? They made the documentary, and there was a fight between Hemingway and Orwell in that time, and that's when like Hemingway and Dos Passos, their friendship broke apart, and but yeah, I think I want to say Hughes wrote for a Baltimore paper, maybe Baltimore Star or Baltimore Sun, I can't remember which.
Oh, so I mean, I guess if we're looking for the next generation of great American writers, we should be looking at who is stationed abroad right now.
Go to war.
Yeah. That's terrible.
But
I know.
This is terrible. But it did, create some interesting characters. So so. What was your first step along that journey? So you had this realization. And then you were like, "Hey, I need to dive into this." Was there information available? Was that book written at the time? Or?
Not yet. It came up. Okay. It came out, I think, in the middle of my research, which was awesome. I jumped on it, and then it was nice. I got to write a review for the book because I presented at a conference, and they're like, "Hey, we wrote this book. Could you review it since you've read it?" And I said, "Yeah." And so I at the time was also starting to get into, like, you have to have for my master's program, we had, the theory you got to focus on. And I focused on geography and looking at cultural landscapes and cultural geography and how space changes how people behave. And I was drawn to this as a kid, not that theory entirely, but I moved back and forth between Wyoming and New York. And I noticed that I was kind of a little punk in New York, more so than I was in Wyoming. And I was like, it must be the trees. Nobody can see me. And so thinking about the fact that Hemingway hung out with Hughes in Spain and that nobody had heard of it, I felt like, okay, it has to do with the space. And so I started looking at all of the other spaces he went. And I think my initial thought was that maybe it has to do with war. Like you have this maybe third space, this space that has no boundaries, no structure, maybe no rules. And so you have a little bit of free reign. You can do what you want. So for Hemingway to hang out with this guy, that would have been okay for him in another country. Like he wasn't too worried about the perception of Americans. But the more I dug, the more I realized I don't know, when he's in the US, he's like the man's man. He's the guy that everybody goes to, and he's the boxer, he's the fighter, he's the drinker, he's all these stereotypes. But when he's in Paris, in the West Bank era, he was learning from Gertrude Stein. He was learning from Ezra Pound, and he was looking up to James Joyce, and he was palling around with F. Scott Fitzgerald. And there was this story when we bring up maybe like all of the isms of Hemingway, like being homophobic or racist or anything along those lines. There's a story where he went to go meet with Gertrude Stein. And at the time when he went into the parlor, Gertrude Stein and her wife Alice were having sex. And so Hemingway just sat and waited until they were done. and then they came out. And Gertrude Stein was, and then he met, and then Gertrude Stein was his first kid's godmother. And I think actually like both of like the couple were the godparents. And so when we think about, okay, this guy that we have all these stereotypes with, when he goes to other countries, it's all different.
Yeah.
Huh.
Well, and I think that you wrote a conference paper that I really liked on Hemingway visiting Wyoming.
Yeah.
And I think for me, that helped me with your sort of bigger thesis, because it's sort of an example of what you do and what you're studying. And you did say about spaces and vernacular landscapes. Can you explain exactly what that is? And then just a little bit about when Hemingway went to Wyoming, because I'm really interested in us expanding this, because we've done several episodes on Theodore Roosevelt and also on the West. So it fits with what we've already done. And I'm really interested how Hemingway fits into it so perfectly.
Okay. I'm going to jump around. So if something doesn't make sense, interrupt. Okay. So first,
Try to keep up, audience.
Yeah.
Geez. Oh, I'm sorry, guys. So vernacular landscape, it's a culture geography term. And I know that E.C. Ralph uses it a bit, and I'm sorry, I can't think of the other guy's name that I think came up with it. But really the idea is that we have a perception of spaces. And so if you think of Las Vegas is a space for debauchery. And so because we have that perception of that space, people go, and it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You go to that space and you behave in that way. And so the idea of a vernacular landscape is, regardless of what is occurring in that space, regardless of maybe the physical truths of the landscape and of the space itself, the perception of the space is how maybe we perceive it, or like the generalized cultural perception. And so when we think about something like the West, we have these like opinion makers. So big names that people are going to listen to. You got Owen Wister, you got Theodore Roosevelt, and they're writing about the West in this very romanticized, like, the good guy's gonna kill 40 people because somebody stole a cow. And we know he's good because he can out-violent the violent. And so we have this really weird idea of like what the West is. And so there's this expectation that when you go West, boy, you're in that kind of country. And so Roosevelt started this. I mean, Roosevelt was a big contributor to this. And I think you see this with a lot of folks from the East Coast, and a lot of your prominent writers of the West are from the East Coast, like Edward Abbey, who's a little bit more modern, was from Pennsylvania. Roosevelt's from the East Coast. Owen Wister was from the East Coast. And so they come out to live this Western experience. And then they are the ones who then define the West through their writing. And so it's not necessarily Westerners. It's not people from the area. It's these folks coming in with maybe a new lens and a romanticized lens. And so they see what they want to see. And so for Roosevelt, he glorifies the cowboy in a way that nobody had done before. And he wrote these essays in defense of the cowboys. And he took somebody that was maybe on par with, I don't know, like railroad workers and other kind of blue collar labor and other transient labor. And he brought them to like this most glorious thing that really is still there. Like people really look at cowboys in the same way. And that has kind of defined the West. So when we think of the West, when you think of the space, like the vernacular landscape of the West is usually tied to like cowboys, wind and prairie, violence. And ironically, I think there's a lot of folks, especially old Westerns, it's very white. When like the original vaqueros obviously weren't white, and we had a lot of black cowboys like after the Civil War. So we have this very curated through the likes of, again, Owen Wister or Zane Grey, of what the idea of the West is, and Teddy Roosevelt. So in comes Hemingway. Hemingway, when he was a little kid, loved Teddy Roosevelt. And it started from, there was a film, I want to say 1911, when Teddy Roosevelt went off to Africa, went on a safari, and that film came through, I think it was Chicago, Oak Park, where Hemingway was growing up. And so Hemingway saw this movie, then he started dressing like Teddy Roosevelt, and he had his little safari outfit and marching around and wanted to be like that. And Hemingway so badly wanted to be part of the Boy Scouts, because Roosevelt was kind of like a big figure for the Boy Scouts at the time. Mm-hmm. He never was, but that was kind of the draw, was a lot of what he saw in Roosevelt. And so as you follow Hemingway's life trajectory, you see how much he's trying to maybe still follow in the steps of Roosevelt in a way.
Mhm.
And this idea of going west to be masculine that Roosevelt did, that all these other guys did, like they were sickly kids and then they went west and became man.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Hemingway didn't start going west until the 20s, late 20s.
Mhm.
And the first trip he took out west was after one of his kids was born. And he fled, and in his writing and in his letters, he fled. He wanted to get away. He wanted to get away from the screaming kid. Yeah, and he wanted to experience man things. And when he comes out, the first place he ends up is at a dude ranch, which like a dude ranch is where tourists come to go play out cowboy.
Yeah, to experience man things.
That's
Yeah.
right.
You know, for money.
For money. Yeah. Yeah. I will pay you to make me feel like a man. Nothing against dude ranches. People have a great time. Okay. So he goes out, and the first dude ranch he goes to, he's with his buddy Bill Horn, and there's just women everywhere. And this Hemingway was like, this isn't manly. And he tries to go fishing, and there's women in the way. Yeah. And he has this journal entries, and it's like, all these women around. I went fishing, didn't catch anything. Couple women, caught a couple fish, and then went by myself, caught my limit. And it's just, did you? I don't know.
Can't let the ladies do better.
No.
Mm-mm.
And so he left. Bill Horn stayed. He's like, no, I like this. There's women everywhere. And he actually met his wife there. And so Hemingway goes off to another ranch. Yeah. And he gets the experience. It's still a dude ranch. It's just a little bit rougher. And so every year until he divorces his second wife, Pauline, man, I'll feel silly if that's wrong. He divorces her, and the couple they're staying with also gets divorced. And so that kind of ends the trips to Wyoming. But he travels to Wyoming every time he returns from Europe. And at the time, Europe is highly effeminate, or in the American perception, they have this like travel America first, and they think of the Europe as, effeminate space. And so I think there was something to Hemingway saying like, okay, I'm coming back from Europe. I've got to like reinstate my masculinity. Let's go to Wyoming and shoot stuff.
Interesting.
I mean, yeah, you got a palate cleanse.
Yeah.
Like a piece of ginger when you're switching sushis.
And his palate cleanse was, this is a terrible story. They bear baited. So they would kill a horse, let it sit out and rot. And then bears would come, and like, you would kind of know they were there, and then you'd go shoot it. And so the story, and I don't know if it's absolutely true, but Hemingway was riding a horse, I think named Goofy, and took off into the trees, and Hemingway got hit. That's why he had the scar on his chin, like got hit by a tree, fell off. And he's like, this is the horse I'm going to use for bear bait. And, but yeah, he would shoot as much as he could. And he took journal entries, and in his entries, he was always the greatest hunter ever. But he still had a guide. He had this guy he hung out with a bunch that would take him around and like through the mountains in northern Wyoming and southern Montana. So anyway, yeah. So going to Wyoming to be a man, to go hunt things, and to be a tourist, even though he would hate being called a tourist.
Right.
In that essay, you talked about how he wanted to be, not just hated being called a tourist, like tried to ingratiate himself with the people who were there, not with the other tourists, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And
sounded like he knew how to be charming.
Oh yeah. And I think that's in most circumstances, folks liked him. In that one-on-one, people really liked him. And can I tell you a story that has nothing to do with this? That's so Hemingway.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so I think this is maybe one of the best examples of people saying, what I expected is not what I got when I met Hemingway. And so Joseph Karsh, photographer, Karsh of Ottawa, who's famous for a bunch of portraits. One of the Albert Einstein, where he's got the high sweater on looking off in the distance, and of Winston Churchill, where he's grumbling at the camera. And he's grumbling because Karsh said, hey, I don't want your cigar in the picture. And he's like, well, I'm keeping my cigar. And so Karsh goes up, takes a cigar out of his mouth, and goes back to the camera. And so Churchill's leaning in, angry at him. And so he snaps the picture, and it's great. And so Karsh gets a phone call from Hemingway, and Hemingway says, hey, I like your photography. I saw your portrait of Albert Einstein. Could you take a picture of me in a sweater? And so first off, you're like, this guy who hunts and fishes and all that, like he's asking for a nice portrait and a sweater.
Yeah.
So Karsh goes to visit him. And this is later in Hemingway's life. And this is the famous one, high sweater looking off, a lot of times associated with Old Man in the Sea. And when Karsh gets there, he did his research. And Hemingway at the time is plastered all over men's magazines of the 50s. And he's like an Old Spice commercial on those where he's like, got a beer or a whiskey and there's explosions in the background. And it's kind of ridiculous. But Karsh goes to Hemingway's house. And he's thinking, all right, I know this guy. I've read his books. I know what he's like. And Hemingway welcomes him in and, they talk a little bit. And he's like, Hemingway offers Karsh a drink. And Karsh, it's early in the morning. He's like, okay, this guy's a drinker. I'd like a daiquiri. And Hemingway was like, good God, man, it's 9 a.m. and right away.
It's 5 o'clock somewhere.
Yeah. Karsh was surprised. He's like, wait, I thought this guy was, the drinker of drinkers.
Yeah, you're that guy. No?
You're the guy. Yeah. And so the rest of the day, as Karsh is taking the photos, he commented on how quiet and how kind Hemingway was. And this is shortly after Hemingway was in a couple plane crashes in Africa, one of which there were headlines that said he was dead that went around the world. And he wasn't. It's just terrible brain injury. And so Hemingway was in a lot of pain just because his brain, his ears were leaking. And so that's why he's looking off in the distance, because Karsh didn't want him to look like, he was not a photographer to expose anything. He wanted people to be happy with their picture. Mm-hmm. So that's why Hemingway's looking away from the camera, because Karsh didn't want him to look into the camera because it would look like he's hurting. And there's also likely a filter. I had a photographer tell me it was probably a green filter over the lens to pull out the splotchiness of Hemingway's skin. And again, this is that performance of like, let's make him look weathered. Let's make him look more manly. And so we have this continuous performance of the stereotype of maybe what's deemed a tough, good man. Mm-hmm.
I haven't been. I'm going to mention it because I'm going to keep thinking about it for the rest of the time. But as soon as you said, "Oh, he asked to get a picture taken in a sweater," the first thing I thought of was that picture of Billy Crystal squatting in that chunky white sweater. But that in a long line of significant men, American men being photographed in sweaters.
Yeah, I mean it's a good photo.
Yeah, it's a great photo. I'm looking at the sweater right now.
The Billy Crystal one?
Yeah,
you gotta.
Not the Billy Crystal one. The not the sweater. The picture of Hemingway right now. And I think, you're totally right in your description. His skin is blotchy. It's pretty high key lighting to expose a lot of those shadows. They're not trying to. It's flattering, but rough at the same time. Mm-hmm. It captures a lot of probably what he was actually how he wanted to be perceived.
Yeah.
Right.
So you mentioned that there's a gap between the guy and this sort of persona that he's putting on in just the time he starts drinking in the morning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
At least. Did this research lead you to any conclusions about Hemingway, the person and the reasons for putting on this persona and the reasons for the palate cleansing?
There are a bunch of theories about why, there's a lot more research looking at person persona. Mm-hmm. There are some theories that he was gay. I don't really think that. Mm-hmm. And I think there's definitely gender bending in his writing. And I think he was maybe more fluid than people think. But I feel like there's other things going on. When he was young, he very clearly stated I think it was in a letter to somebody, or I can't remember where I read it, but he said, I want to be famous. And so this idea of what does it mean to be famous in America for Hemingway at the time was, let's look at the famous men of the time. You have, Bernard McFadden, who was the health guru. You have Teddy Roosevelt. You have a very specific kind of man that is getting attention. Mm-hmm. And so Hemingway, I think, was very aware of what it would take for him to be famous and to maintain popularity in the United States. And I think that's probably why he didn't hang out in the United States a whole heck of a lot, like living in Cuba and being overseas a great deal of the time. I think that was probably easier for him than having to be in the US, and he's recognizable probably everywhere, and not having to perform, a certain way. And I think towards the end of his life, we start seeing, and I think it's probably because of head injury and he's not able to write as well. We see maybe the person persona blending, like he's trying to perform what he's created. And it's kind of like you're not sure where he's at. But I think some of this performance starts early. So World War I, Hemingway can't be a soldier. And so he goes over with the Red Cross and he drives ambulances and he's delivering cigarettes and chocolate in Italy. There's a bomb goes off. I think it's in Italy. Bomb goes off. He ends up getting blown up. And in the process, he saves, I want to say 2 Italian soldiers, drags them to safety. And so in this moment, he's severely injured. He has like 230 some pieces of metal in his legs from shrapnel and from bullets. And he ends up earning I think it's called Croce di Guerra. It's the Italian like cross, I guess. And it's this huge thing. And so there are articles that start coming out in newspapers. And the first one is in his hometown in Oak Park. And it says what happened. And then for the next couple of weeks, more and more articles come out. And by the end, it's like searchlights were going across no man's land. And Hemingway decided to go save these people. And he was blown up in the process. And he saved 10 men. And so this exaggeration builds him up into something more. And he knew about these articles. And he recognized the attention he was getting. And when he came back to the United States, he had a lieutenant's cloak or a lieutenant's coat from one of the Italians. And somebody was like, "Oh, lieutenant." And he would never correct anybody. And so if these stories came out, he wouldn't correct them. And so there's also this hard line too, where he was not a soldier, but he did save a guy and he got shot up. Like he experienced war in a brutal, brutal manner, but he was, again, never a soldier. And so if you look at his writing, a lot of it is from the perspective of a soldier or from somebody that's in some sort of service. And so Hemingway, I feel like he's trying to build that up and he's trying to build up that identity. And that's something that he knows can give him some credibility. So like Farewell to Arms is very popular. We got a soldier who's injured. And I don't know if you know the story. So the soldier injured, I'm going to ruin Farewell to Arms. Silver Linings Playbook ruined it too. At the end of the book, we have a soldier who escapes with this woman he loves and they're pregnant and they get somewhere safe. And the last like 3 pages, the woman dies in childbirth, the child dies. And then the main character is like, oh no. So this is loosely based on Hemingway's experience. He fell in love with a nurse that was taking care of him when he was injured. And eventually the nurse got tired of him and went off with an Italian. And Hemingway, in his very Shakespearean, I'm going to make you live in infamy sort of thing, kills her off in the book because he's upset that she broke up with him. But anyway, so he's performing all of these, again, heroic things, or I guess not correcting people. And if they say anything, and he's writing in a way that makes it seem like he has this experience. And, even modern writers say, oh, how do you do research? I do it the way Hemingway did, which assumes that you went and lived the experience and just had a really thin veil over the literature. And so he was never a soldier, but he was still in war a lot. And this is, again, where this blends. Being in the Spanish Civil War, he made his way to France for D-Day. And he got in a lot of trouble, but he got like a bunch of guerrilla guys. They found some guns and they wandered into France and like got behind lines and were kind of going around and they're like, oh, we're going to bring guns to people. And he also, before he went over as a correspondent in World War II, he thought that in Cuba, they were going to like find a U-boat. So him and his buddies loaded his boat with guns and bombs or like grenades and stuff. And their thought was that if a U-boat comes up, they're going to pop up and open the hatch and they'll be like, oh, it's a fishing boat. And then they're going to, Hemingway's going to throw bombs and shoot him. So anyway, when we have all this writing that is very much like war focused, and we have this experience that is sort of vague, I think by the end of his life, when we see that person persona start blending is because, he's seeing it and he also has maybe the credibility. At one point in Wyoming, his wife, Mary, his last wife, she had a miscarriage. They were flying through, landed in Casper, Wyoming, and she had, I can't remember. It's where the egg gets caught in the fallopian tube. And so
An ectopic pregnancy.
Ectopic.
thank you.
Yeah.
And so they go in and the doctor isn't there and things are going bad and there's like blood everywhere and they're like, she's going to die. And Hemingway's like, get out of the way. And he goes in and because of his war experience and being around it, he saved his wife's life. And so
wow.
he's good in the moment.
Mhm.
And I think this is where we have this hard thing of like, he does have some pretty solid credibility, but not maybe to the extent that he says he has.
That's such an interesting tension because I'm going to try to draw a connection to something you said earlier, or something we brought up earlier in that him not wanting to be perceived as a tourist, like, or he being called a tourist, and his ability to like sort of ingratiate himself and pretend to be a local, whatever environment he's in. There's a level of falseness there, but also a certain amount of authenticity that's necessary to be able to pull it off.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
it requires both of those things, like both a non-commitment, a totally fluid sense of self, but also a lot of strong character at the same time, which is very weird. But I can understand the want to do that, or the instinct to do that. It reminds me of a little bit of like Anthony Bourdain, right? When he says like, when you're traveling, don't ask the concierge where to go eat. Ask the person working in the kitchen where they go out. That's where you'll find the best places, right? Like, you know, put yourself in the position of the local. Don't tourist like a tourist. But yeah, that's an interesting blend or tension in that, especially for someone who wanted to be famous, right? I want to be known. I could see that being a useful aspect of his personality.
Right. It seems like he was successful. You said earlier, you know, everyone knows how it is in Vegas. So, you know, if you're at Vegas and you meet someone, you probably register, this is not their normal. This obviously they don't act like this normally, you know.
Right.
Like, oh, they're being their Vegas self. But it seems like, I mean, was he perceived as, when he was trying to be a non-tourist, was he accepted more by the locals, or were they like, oh, look at this guy pretending like he belongs here? And the same in Europe. I mean, was it working? Was his curated personality, his curated, you know, individualism, was it working with locals? Did they buy it? I mean, a lot of these stories, it seems like he's doing it and he's succeeding, but I'm just wondering.
Although at the Dude Ranch, the ranch hands worked there, so whether he was hanging out with them or not, they were still getting paid. Like, this guy is a customer of ours. So
you have to be nice and hang out. Yeah,
I think it depends on where he was. Like in France, he was there, you know, as a young man, and he really only hung out with Americans. Hung out with Gertrude Stein of Scott. So that was kind of, he was in the, you know, the West Bank and where all the other expats were, and so he didn't have a ton of time with other folks. He spoke French okay, or not great. He could probably get by. He wrote Wine of Wyoming. Half of it's in French, and French speakers are like, this is terrible. And so, and so there's that thing. In Spain, because he would do the running the bulls. He loved Pamplona, or I can't think of words. Whatever the running the bulls is. And
that's what it is.
Enjoyed. Yeah. Pamplona. Is that right? Yeah.
So.
Anyway, he's loved it. Had a great time. He wrote Death in the Afternoon, which is all about bullfighting and how beautiful it is. And in Death in the Afternoon, it's nonfiction. He says, and all the locals thought I spoke like them. And so somebody went after the fact and went to one of the locals that he kept referencing. And they're like, hey, how was Hemingway Spanish? And she's like, terrible. He was so bad at it. And so, you know, like, there's that. And when he'd go to Africa, he was with great white hunters. Like, he was with the guys that would take him on a hunting trip. And he also, there's this odd thing at the end of his life, or towards the end, where he goes to a tribe. There's a story that he marries one of the ladies in the tribe. And it's like, whatever ceremony, he shaves his head to be like the tribe. And he's like, I want to be like you guys. And this is post-brain injury, but even then he was still on the outside. And so to an American audience, he could put himself in the center of it and say, I'm the expert. But everywhere else, he was looking up to somebody else. And you know, in Spain, he was following the bullfighters that he idolized. In all the war spaces, he was going as close to combat as he could, though he wasn't really in it. he tried to be a couple times, like he carried a gun, even though he was pressed and he shouldn't have. And so we have these moments where, like, again, the question of, did the locals think he blended?
Mhm.
And I don't think in a lot of spaces, in Cuba, maybe more, because he was very much on the side of like let's get away from Batista and like, let's have a revolution.
Mhm.
In Wyoming, he went hunting a lot with this guy named I think is Ivan. I'm sorry, I'm dying on names, but he went hunting with this guy, and he was one of the ranch hands, but they became good buddies. And like Ivan would be like, hey, let's go fishing. And so Hemingway would give up on writing and go fishing. At one point in one of their hunts, this guy asked Hemingway, he's like, hey, I've never read one of your books. Like, what should I read? And Hemingway says, don't read any of them. He's like, you're not going to think any better of me if you do. And so we also have this, again, like, he's trying to be authentic with this guy.
Mhm.
And are the books that performance that doesn't allow, like, yeah, if you think my work that's made me all this money is going to make you think differently of me, that's, I think, really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, not diving any deeper than what we've talked about in this conversation, like that an authentic retelling of the things, even though he was pressed in some of these situations, he's actually in writing nonfiction. Like, it doesn't seem like that was the goal necessarily, at least his over like meta goal for himself. It was not, hey, I'm trying to sort of convey the realities of these experiences for other people. It was, I'm putting myself at the center of it because I'm this guy, right? Like, I want to be this, right? So like, that's what he is. If that is one of his like childhood goals and something that like his deep seated need, it makes sense that no matter where he goes and when he retells it, he's the center of the story. He's the protagonist. He would have been insufferable with an Instagram account. Just the worst.
I think about like, well, Twitter would have been great for him.
Twitter would have, I think,
done.
Yeah, those would have been great. But like, imagining him doing like posts of and like doing reels of like,
here,
like,
I'm gonna grab
I'm out here, out here. Like, look at this thing I just killed. Right. It would have been
there
the
are
worst.
Those pictures. There's so many of them of him with like giant marlins that he's killed. And even when he was a little kid, like lining up fish with through the stick in the Upper Peninsula. And so, yeah, he was doing it, just not posting them.
I think he needs an Instagram account post-mortem. I don't know about you, but
I've seen a couple of other presidential post-mortem Twitter accounts.
Millard Fillmore has a Twitter account. I mean, why not Hemingway?
But it's interesting in terms of like thinking about him in sort of the context of this mythos. And have you talked a lot, or not talked a lot? Have you investigated at all sort of like the persistent effect of his persona that he's put out? Because I'm trying to think of more modern versions. This kind of writer doesn't really exist anymore. There's a few that in the past, like in my lifetime, Sam Shepard comes to mind. Hunter S. Thompson, I suppose, is sort of like in that same vein. But I can't think of anyone today who's working that has that same kind of like
that punchy,
that kind of like, I'm a man's man, and but I'm really good with a pen.
Right.
Not that Hunter S. Thompson was that, but Sam Shepard probably closer.
I think that Hemingway's writing had a tremendous impact at the moment. And so I think, prior to him, we have Victorian writing. Victorians, like the novel comes about in that era. And so we have like the Jane Austens, and we have these flowery, really long, in my mind, convoluted sort of writing. And it's really great. But then Hemingway, being trained as a newspaper writer, he has this, I don't know, was it Kansas Star? But this kind of like cheat page of what you cut out. And he started writing, I want to say obituaries. And if that's wrong, I'm sorry. But he started writing very short pieces. And so he had to be concise, and his editor would tear it apart. And so when his book hit the scene, and I guess just like thinking of time frame, 1924-25 is when F. Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby came out. And that is, flowery, it's all over. And Hemingway saw this. He knows F. Scott. He's friends with him. And he's like, okay, that's all right. I can write the great American novel too. And so he writes The Sun Also Rises. And it is punchy and choppy. He wrote it, I want to say, in like 8 weeks. He went on that trip and then wrote it
Nice.
quick. So his 2 best books, in Sun Also Rises, Old Man and the Sea, he wrote within just a few months. And so I feel like literary scene, he kind of blew it up. And so I don't know that, yes, and there's not a lot of people writing like him now, but I think there's still the influence of his writing. And like the idea of the iceberg effect, where I don't have to tell you everything. I'm going to maybe leave it off at the end. I think of Karen Russell. She's one of my favorite writers right now. She's out of Florida. And she writes these brilliant short stories that at the end, you're like, I don't know what the hell's going on. This was great. And you have to go back and reread it and you can kind of figure it out. And it's fun. But I think Hemingway had contributed a lot to writing. So yeah, I don't know that in terms of literature, we can say that people are still writing like him, but I still think he had a huge, huge impact of how folks are writing today.
I think so. I'm a little bit of an apologist amongst people for liking his work a lot. I had in college I had a theory that anyone who hung out with James Joyce took one look at a long sentence and was like, no more. Beckett had the same reaction.
Too bad Faulkner didn't hang out with him.
I know. But yeah, I mean, even in that sort of the idea of that masculinity. The reason this is actually, I don't know if anyone I've ever told this story, definitely not on the podcast, but I got to see him speak when I was at NYU, Sam Shepard. And I think it must've been Ages of the Moon. There was the play that he had just finished, and someone and asked him like, oh, how'd you write it? And I'm pretty sure his answer was, I wrote it on the road. And he meant like literally driving. And it were like, and half the students were like, oh my gosh. And then like everyone was like, what are you talking about, man? But it was like that kind of like mythos built up around that. It's not quite romanticized, but it is like a weirdly masculine version of that kind of pursuit, where it's like physical at some level, like artistic pursuit is physical at the same time. He feels like Hemingway, he feels like the peak of that version of artist. I can't think of anyone else that has sort of superseded him in that space.
Yeah.
But Lynn, as a woman, how did you react to his writing? Like, did you read much Hemingway growing up? What did you think? Out of curiosity,
I read in college and in high school a lot of his work, and I remember enjoying it. Yeah, I don't remember disliking him, but I haven't really read much about him. Sorry, since those days. Long time ago. Although this is making me want to go back and reread in understanding who he was as a person, because honestly, that's what makes me more interested in literature as a historian. Is I want to know the author, so then I can know where he was when he was writing these things, and having this background now and thinking about this authentic versus put upon persona is absolutely fascinating. And on that same level, I think you mentioned in the conference paper about how this idea of the West may have never even existed in reality, that it was this entirely conceived location that by thinking of what it should be, we created it, but it never authentically existed. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because we've talked about the West in several episodes.
Yeah.
And that just fascinates me.
No, for sure. And I think on the note of reading him or not reading him, I think whatever you want to do, no pressure. And I think like to the apologists, like the idea of like, I know he did terrible things. Absolutely. I think what is interesting is the impact he's had, and like struggling with suicide his whole life. Like his dad killed himself, and horrible story. After his dad did that, his mom packaged up the gun and sent it to Hemingway, and Hemingway ended up, taking it, dropping it in a lake on when he was out in one of the ranches with that guy that he hung out with. He dropped it in one of the lakes.
Yeah. Crazy. Also, as far as being apologist, I meant more for his writing style.
Yeah.
Like as a people in school were at the time who wanted to be writers, looked down on his kind of like that literally the accessibility of his writing as a net negative.
It's the thing with historians.
I'm a big fan
not that
of
they
it.
look down on, but the more accessible things are, the less intellectual they
the less literary
perceived.
it is.
Right.
That's so, it's like Gertrude Stein wrote this book called Tender Buttons, It's Poetry. And she's trying to prove like that language and words are arbitrary, like the connection is arbitrary, like very linguistic. It's miserable to read. It's terrible.
Yeah.
Like I can appreciate it, but man, I was like, God, I would like to know something straightforward.
Yeah.
I will say very few of those people had ever read Finnegan's Wake. So like the people who had that criticism of him, and I was like, well, okay.
Yeah, try this one.
Put up or shut up. Right? Come on. You either go
Yeah.
Which one do you pick?
As disconnected as you could possibly get.
For sure.
But yeah, no, that's I'm a big appreciator of and especially the effect that his writing has had on because I do think accessibility is important.
Yeah.
And now that you've talked about sort of where his priorities were and what kind of work he wanted to do, beyond even just his influence as a, because he's definitely capable of doing more, like of being more flowery and being more, but chose not to. I'm certain. Maybe I'm certain by maybe stretching, but it feels like it maybe have been for accessibility purposes. Like if you wanted it to be widely read, you can't be too crazy.
Now, don't forget, Isaac, he still has to talk about the West. But yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I have a quick
Isaac
answer, and then I've got so much for the West. I'm really excited. So for the writing, the artist Paul Cézanne?
Yeah.
He's famous for, he has this work where it's like mountains, river, trees, and then he continuously pulled things away to see what would people be able to look at and still recognize. And so Hemingway really loved Paul Cézanne's art, and he wanted to do that in his writing as well. So like we have this influence of the newspaper background and the accessibility of something like what Cézanne's doing, but also there's so much depth under that. And so I think it's deceiving that you're like, oh, it's so simple. There's a lot of layers underneath, but you can still understand maybe a surface level, which is, I feel like what Cézanne, it's super interesting. Okay, the West.
Yeah.
All right. I feel like, so I'm from Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Cheyenne has an event called Cheyenne Frontier Days. And Cheyenne Frontier Days is, I think, if it isn't still, it was the biggest outdoor rodeo in the world. And Frontier Days came about at a time when people in town wanted an event and they wanted to maybe glorify the frontier. And the beginning of Frontier Days was at a moment when Cheyenne had a few opera houses. They were a very metropolitan area, and it was part of the cattle boom. There was a lot of money in Cheyenne at the time. And so Cheyenne was almost like kind of a metropolis for a moment. And then Cheyenne Frontier Days continued, and it was this, again, it was a performance of something that maybe wasn't there. But then after a while, Cheyenne started building their identity around Frontier Days. And so the opera houses, one of them burned down, one of them I think was torn down. And there's a moment in like the 1950s, 60s, where there was an idea that Cheyenne needs, any new buildings in the downtown had to look Western. And so, and so again, like Western in terms of like spaghetti Western, who knows, but it's still this identity around Frontier Days. And so growing up, this was something I was like, man, the town isn't just Frontier Days. That's 10 days out of the year.
Yeah.
But so much of the identity of that space was that festival. And currently it's still big. It brings in a lot of money. People get really excited. Folks pull out their cowboy hat. And it's this, I don't know. People know that's not what we are. People who live here know that's not what we are. But then they'll put on the outfit and they'll go be a cowboy. Even if they've never ridden a horse or been to a branding or whatever. I was talking to a politician who I taught her son, and she said, when I ran for office, she's like, you better believe I put on that cowboy hat and I put on the outfit and I went and did the things. And she's like, I grew up on a ranch and you didn't wear those things into town. Like those were your work clothes. And then when we went to town, you dressed nice. And so she said, this is all that performative idea of what the West is. And so it's this kind of like chicken before the egg sort of thing where we have the stories of the Virginian, which had a huge impact. And you have the movies and you have the festival like Frontier Days and other frontier or rodeo style events that popped up in the West that started gaining some momentum, and people built their identity around those things. And it's back to that vernacular landscape. They projected onto the space what they wanted, and they became that, even if it wasn't necessarily authentic, but
Right.
eventually does it become authentic because it's been around for so long and that's what you've kind of grown up with.
That's what's interesting is it becomes authentic. It's like you perform so much that it becomes authentic. That's fascinating.
Huh. Yeah, this is there's a whole separate conversation to be had about sort of like the nature of authenticity and personhood and identity in that I'll table for probably an offline conversation to save our audience who is here for history and have somehow stuck around for like a literary podcast.
Sorry,
Apologies
guys.
to well, my fault. I don't get to talk about writing all that often, and clearly I should. I still want to, apparently. But yeah, that's fascinating because it almost, when you first defined vernacular landscape, it feels a little bit like you're anthropomorphizing. Like it seems like it's something that people do when they move from space to space. But it's interesting to thinking about both the interplay of a space having that being projected upon and then sort of having an effect on the people who are there, even the ones who weren't doing the projecting in theory. That's a very fascinating interplay. And I'm curious, Lynn, just for a future, where just think about that theme when we're talking about other folks traveling around and being in different spaces. It's a really interesting perspective from which to look at history and people who are moving in different geographical locations.
And how, I mean, and that those perceptions are layered too, right? And you have maybe like the hegemonic or like the mainstream idea of what a space is, and then you have, pockets of individuals, and I like, you think of sacred spaces for whatever variety of groups or indigenous folks, like these spaces mean something very specific, and then it's overlaid with something else, and so we have also those competing perceptions of what the space is for and what you expect to happen there. It's wild.
Yeah.
A really good way to look at history and to remind people that place matters. That it's
so much.
Not just people, but place plays quite a role. Yeah.
This is adding another layer to like the perspective. You get like the great man way of looking at history. You've got the trends, and then you've got the the spatial relations of everything going on, like the geographical aspect of it all.
Absolutely.
This is definitely a level of depth for someone like Hemingway that I don't think many people have thought of in a historical context. That I think is very interesting and illuminating for the field overall. It's a really interesting way to take a look at stuff, and for anyone who's doing some cowboy cosplay at the moment, because there's plenty of people that do it, Elon Musk included.
And remember, we also had an episode with Jason Herbert where he reminds us that cowboys were actually started in Florida. With natives.
The original cattle ranchers.
The original cattle ranchers were in Florida, and they were native. So you've got that whole cowboy, and then you've got the Western cowboy mix.
And you got like the from coming up from Mexico, like the vaquero, like the outfits, and so much of that coming from the South, and I think also impacted by, like folks that were enslaved going out west to get away from that space and then finding work there and having like that culture embedded in. And it's
a much more complicated thing than
it's not a Clint Eastwood movie.
No, I was gonna say John Ford, but same difference.
There's
a lot going on. Well, I this was an awesome. Do you have any? This is actually a great question for you, given that at Wyoming. So one of the things that we like to say repeatedly is that everyone listening to this lives probably within an hour of something cool historically, like an hour's drive that's not like a mainstream museum or a small historical site. Is there any place out in Wyoming or is there a cool spot that is a little bit off the beaten trail that would be worth visiting if you were interested in the history of the West and this kind of any of these kind of topics that we've been discussing, or Hemingway?
So I mean, Hemingway got married in Cheyenne, Wyoming at one point on his trip. That was his third wife, Martha Gellhorn. They got married in Cheyenne. So that's interesting. But I think cool history that is maybe unknown and off the beaten path. I don't know if there's much there anymore. But Empire, Wyoming was a Black community that was established in Wyoming after the, formerly like the Great Migration. It was like early 1900s, and it was a town for a little while. And then folks in Cheyenne got a hold of the KKK, and they came in, and they ended up lynching 2 of the town leaders, and then the town dispersed. And so we have, in terms of history in Wyoming history, like these are the stories that don't get told that absolutely should be told. But yeah, Empire, Wyoming, that's about an hour away from where I am.
Oh yeah, so if you're traveling through Wyoming, it's worth
absolutely
checking out some of that local history.
And there's been some brilliant research on that. I probably didn't do it justice within the last few years. So if you come through and you look up Empire, there's going to be some really cool resources that some folks have put together.
Nice.
Very cool.
All right.
Very neat. Worth checking out. Is there, so as far as your work or any public work that you're doing, is there anywhere that our audience could find you or follow any of the stuff you do? Do you post on social media, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I'm so bad at social media, man. I wish I was better. But so I have a few things going. I have a podcast about why teachers leave education. So those who can't teach anymore. I'm an instructor now at a college, but I taught high school for like 11 years. And so looking at the history of education and the politics behind it and the pop culture of it and why folks might be leaving. And kind of like the history and Western stuff, I've worked on the podcast, The Modern West, which is a Wyoming Public Radio podcast, but it's really cool. We did a season looking at I'm spacing it. The Plains Indian Wars, and from the perspective of the tribes. And so our host spoke to elders, and they looked at winter counts, and they did all these things. And it's just, man, it's good. I did the music for it, or I didn't play it, but I mixed for it. And trying to layer songs to stuff, I was like crying hearing these stories that are just devastating.
Wow.
And there's a couple other really great seasons within the Modern West. I will have a podcast. Hopefully it'll come out this fall with my buddy, Diego Javier Luis. He wrote a book called The First Asians in the Americas. He was on your guys' show, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Our listeners may be familiar.
So Diego and I and our friend Julian Saporiti, who's No Boy for his music, we got together, and we're going to be looking at Diego's book and telling some of the stories from the book, but really focusing on Diego as a person, a historian, and maybe why he's the right person to be telling this history and how to tell this history honestly, which takes looking at yourself a little bit more honestly, which is really damn hard. And I'll have a second season of that teacher podcast coming out later in the spring. So I guess chronologically, that's the stuff I have.
Yeah, all that sounds fantastic, and you may be able to catch a little bit more about that podcast with Diego if you pay attention to what we've got going on here at Primary Source Media. So be sure to subscribe.
Be sure to skim on down to the show notes, because we'll have links to everything that Charles has just mentioned, so you have easy access to visit all of his shows and podcasts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as always, this conversation was brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. So if you enjoyed this, please consider going on over to patreon.com/primary source media. Even if you just join, it's free. You get access to our Discord if you do that, and a bunch of cool conversations that are taking place on there. But if you feel so inclined and have the ability, we always appreciate the monetary support. It gives you early access to content and even some book giveaways, some signed book giveaways from some of the authors that we've talked to, which is amongst other exciting things. So try to check that out at patreon.com/primary source media. Charles, thank you so much. This is such an awesome conversation. Really enjoyable.
Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
It's fun to get to geek out about Hemingway. I haven't done it in a while, so that was great.
Yeah.